The rotting floorboard gave way beneath Sarah's foot, plunging her leg into darkness as she screamed, not from pain, but from the glint of something massive and golden staring back at her from the depths below. What she and her husband thought was their last desperate gamble on a crumbling farmhouse would become the discovery that changed not just their lives, but exposed a century-old secret that someone was willing to kill to protect. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Sarah and Michael Chin had reached the end of their rope. After 23 years of marriage, 2 kids through college, and a small restaurant that had been their pride and joy, they were down to their last $8,000. The pandemic had destroyed their business. Their savings had evaporated trying to keep it afloat, and the bank was days away from foreclosing on their home. That's when Michael's obsessive late-night scrolling through real estate listings found it. A 150-year-old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, listed for just $6,000. "It's probably condemned," Sarah said, looking at the grainy photos on his laptop screen. The images showed a 2-story structure that seemed to lean slightly to the left, with missing roof shingles and windows boarded with plywood. "The listing says it's livable," Michael countered, though his voice lacked conviction, "just needs some work." Sarah studied her husband's face in the blue glow of the computer screen. At 52, Michael looked 10 years older than his age. The stress of losing everything they'd built had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His thick black hair, once his pride, had thinned and grayed seemingly overnight. "Livable can mean a lot of things," she said softly. But what she didn't say was what they both knew. They had no other options. The next morning, they drove 4 hours to the property in their battered Honda Civic, the only vehicle they'd managed to keep. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Donna with aggressively blonde hair, met them at the end of a long dirt road. "Now, I'll be honest with you folks," Donna said as they bumped along the pothole-riddled driveway. "The Hartley place has been on the market for 3 years. The family just wants it gone." "Why?" Sarah asked, gripping the door handle as they hit another crater. "Oh, you know how it is with these old places. The last Hartley died about 5 years ago, sweet old Eleanor, lived to be 97. Her kids all moved to the city decades ago. They just want to settle the estate and be done with it." The farmhouse came into view, and Sarah's heart sank. It was worse than the photos. The wraparound porch sagged like a frown, supported by wooden posts that looked more like suggestions than structural elements. Paint peeled from every surface, revealing multiple colors underneath like archaeological layers of past attempts at improvement. A massive oak tree grew dangerously close to the house, its branches scraping against what remained of the roof. "I know it needs some love," Donna said quickly, apparently reading their expressions. "But the bones are good. They built things to last back in 1871. Michael stepped out of the car first, his contractor's eye already cataloging the damage. Before the restaurant, he'd worked construction for 15 years. His hands, Sarah noticed, flexed unconsciously as if already gripping a hammer. "The foundation looks solid," he said, surprising both women. "Stone basement, from what I can see. That's actually good news." They entered through the front door, which squealed protest on rusty hinges. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the boarded windows. The air smelled of must and abandonment. With an underlying scent, Sarah couldn't quite identify something earthy and metallic. "The electricity works," Donna announced, flipping a switch. A single bare bulb illuminated the front hallway, revealing water-stained wallpaper and a staircase that looked like a lawsuit waiting to happen. They toured the house in near silence, each room revealing new challenges. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1950 seconds. The upstairs bathroom's clawfoot tub had become a graveyard for dead insects. Several floorboards were soft with rot, and Michael's foot actually broke through one on the second floor, his leg disappearing up to the knee. "Careful." Sarah rushed to help him up, but he was laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. "Well, now we know where to start the renovations," he said, pulling splinters from his jeans. By the time they returned to the front porch, Sarah had counted at least 50 major repairs needed just to make the place safely habitable. But she'd also noticed the wide plank oak floors under the grime, The intricate crown molding in the parlor, and the view from the kitchen window of rolling hills and ancient forests that seemed to go on forever. "What happened to the Hartley family?" she asked Donna. "You said Eleanor lived here alone?" "Oh, it's a sad story, really. The Hartleys were one of the founding families of the county, made their money in coal and railroads back in the day. But by the time Eleanor inherited the place, most of the fortune was gone. She lived here with just her cats and her memories for the last 30 years. No family visited? Her children tried to get her to move to a nursing home, but she refused. Said she'd die in the house her grandfather built, and that's exactly what she did. Peaceful, in her sleep, in the front bedroom." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They'd buried both sets of parents in the last decade and knew the weight of family history and stubborn pride. "We'll take it," Michael said suddenly. Sarah's head whipped toward him. "Michael, we'll take it," he repeated. His jaw set in that way she recognized from 23 years of marriage. "Cash purchase? How soon can we close?" Donna's eyes widened with poorly concealed delight. "Well, I'll need to run it by the sellers, but given that it's cash and you're willing to take it as is, I imagine we could close within a week." As they drove back to their soon-to-be foreclosed home, Sarah finally broke the silence. "That place is a money pit. You know that, right?" "I know," Michael said, his hands steady on the wheel. "But Sarah, what else are we going to do? At least there, we'll own something. No bank can take it away. We'll fix it up little by little. I still remember how to swing a hammer. The restaurant is gone." His voice was gentle but firm. "We tried everything. Takeout only, meal kits, catering. Nothing worked. But this could be our second chance. We could grow our own food, maybe start a small farm stand, get back to basics." Sarah wanted to argue, to list all the practical reasons why buying a derelict farmhouse with their last pennies was insane. But she looked at her husband's face and saw something that had been missing for months. Hope. "Okay," she said finally. "But if we find any bodies in the walls, I'm out." Michael laughed again, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Deal." The closing happened with shocking speed. The Hartley heirs, two brothers and a sister who attended via video conference from their respective cities, seemed almost embarrassingly eager to unload the property. Papers were signed, money was transferred, and within 6 days, Sarah and Michael Chen were the proud owners of 1847 Hartley Road. They moved in with whatever they could fit in the Honda and a small U-Haul trailer. Most of their furniture had been sold to keep the restaurant running its final months. They had their bed, a kitchen table, 2 chairs, essential cookware, their clothes, and boxes of memories they couldn't bear to part with. Their first night in the farmhouse, they slept on an air mattress in the parlor, the only room where they trusted the floor completely. The house creaked and groaned around them, settling in the cooling night air. Something scurried in the walls, mice, probably, or worse. The wind whistled through gaps in the windows, creating an eerie symphony. "Are we crazy?" Sarah whispered into the darkness. "Probably," Michael admitted, "but at least we're crazy together." The next morning, they began the monumental task of making the house livable. Michael started with the urgent structural issues, the hole he'd put through the floor, the most dangerous sections of the porch, the broken windows that invited in rain and wildlife. Sarah tackled the cleaning, armed with industrial-strength supplies and a determination born of desperation. It was on their 3rd day, as Sarah was scrubbing decades of grime from the kitchen floor, that it happened. She was on her hands and knees, working on a particularly stubborn stain near the butler's pantry, when the floorboard beneath her suddenly splintered and gave way. Her leg plunged through the rotten wood up to her thigh. She yelped in shock more than pain, her hands scrambling for purchase on the surrounding boards. That's when she saw it, a metallic glint in the darkness below. "Michael!" she called, her voice high with excitement. "Michael, come quick!" He thundered down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "I'm fine, but look." She pointed into the hole. "There's something down there, something metal." Michael knelt beside her, helping her extract her leg carefully from the broken boards. Her jeans were torn and her shin was scraped, but nothing serious. He peered into the hole, then sat back on his heels. "We need a flashlight," he said, his voice strange. Sarah hobbled to their supply box and returned with their LED lantern. Michael shone it into the hole, and they both gasped. The light reflected off what appeared to be a metal surface about 3 feet below the kitchen floor, but it wasn't a pipe or a structural beam. It looked like a chest or a strongbox, partially buried in dirt. "There must be a crawl space or something down there," Michael said, already pulling at the adjacent boards. Several came up easily, too rotten to resist. Within minutes, they'd created an opening large enough for a person to fit through. "I'll go," Michael said, but Sarah was already lowering herself through the hole. "My discovery," she said with a grin that made her look 20 years younger. "Besides, I'm smaller." The space beneath the kitchen wasn't quite a basement, more like a root cellar that had been sealed off and forgotten. The walls were stone and dirt, and the ceiling was just high enough for Sarah to stand hunched over. The metal box was partially buried in the dirt floor, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. "It's some kind of trunk," she called up to Michael. "It's really stuck in here. I think, wait, there's more. Oh my God, Michael, there's more." As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, Sarah realized the trunk wasn't alone. The entire floor of the hidden cellar was lumpy with buried objects. Metal corners and edges poked through the dirt everywhere she looked. Michael dropped through the hole to join her, bringing a second flashlight and a shovel. They worked together to free the first trunk, scraping away decades of compacted earth. The metal was brass, green with verdigris, but still solid. There was no lock, just a simple clasp that had rusted shut. "Should we call someone?" Sarah asked, suddenly uncertain. "The police? A lawyer? For what? It's our property now," Michael said. "Whatever's down here, it's ours." He worked at the clasp with a screwdriver until it finally gave way with a screech of protest. They looked at each other, hearts pounding. Then Michael slowly lifted the lid. The flashlight beam fell on neat stacks of gold coins, their surfaces dull with age, but unmistakably genuine. Sarah reached out with trembling fingers to touch one, half expecting it to crumble or vanish like a mirage. It was solid and heavy in her hand. "Double eagles," Michael breathed, recognizing the design. $20 gold pieces. These are from the 1800s. "Sarah, do you have any idea what these are worth?" She shook her head, speechless. They were looking at hundreds, maybe thousands of coins, neatly organized in cloth bags that had mostly rotted away. "We need to see what else is here," Michael said, his practical nature overcoming his shock. "Then we need to figure out what to do." They spent the next 4 hours in that cramped, musty space, unearthing treasure after treasure. 6 more trunks yielded similar contents: gold coins, silver dollars, and paper currency so old it crumbled at a touch. They found jewelry boxes filled with ornate Victorian pieces, pocket watches, and even what appeared to be stock certificates from railroad companies. But the 7th trunk was different. It was newer than the others and sealed with wax around the edges, as if someone had taken extra care to protect its contents. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were ledgers and journals, their pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Sarah carried one of the journals up to better light while Michael continued to catalog their find. The first page bore an inscription: "The private accounts of Jeremiah Hartley, 1889 to 1894. As she read, Sarah's excitement gave way to a different emotion entirely. The ledgers weren't just financial records, they were a detailed account of Jeremiah Hartley's business dealings, including his use of Chinese immigrant labor in his coal mines. The conditions described were horrific, the payments minimal, and there were references to unfortunate losses that seemed to indicate deaths covered up to avoid scrutiny. "Michael," she said slowly, "I think I know why this was all hidden." He climbed up to join her, dirt-streaked and exhausted. As he read over her shoulder, his expression darkened. "Blood money?" he said quietly. He was hiding it because he knew it was wrong. "Look, here, he's talking about investigations, bribes to officials." They found more journals, including ones from Eleanor Hartley's father, discussing how he discovered his father's hidden fortune but couldn't bring himself to spend it or reveal its existence. The guilt had apparently passed down through generations, the treasure becoming a family secret too shameful to expose, but too valuable to destroy. Sarah and Michael sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by pieces of the past. By their rough calculation, they'd unearthed approximately $30 million in gold and collectibles, a fortune by any measure. But the weight of how that fortune was made pressed down on them like a physical thing. "We could keep it?" Michael said finally. "No one knows. It's been hidden for over a century." "Could you?" Sarah asked, meeting his eyes. "Could you renovate this house, knowing every board was paid for with suffering?" He sighed, rubbing his face with dirty hands. No, I couldn't." They were interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp and demanding. Sarah jumped, irrationally fearing that someone already knew what they'd found. Michael went to answer it, returning with a tall man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as William Hartley III. "I'm Eleanor's grandson," he said, his eyes scanning their humble surroundings with barely concealed disdain. "I understand you're the new owners." "That's right," Michael said carefully. "The sale was completely legal. We have all the paperwork." "Oh, I'm not disputing the sale," William said with a thin smile. "I'm here to make you an offer. My family has sentimental attachments to this property. I'd like to buy it back. I'll give you $50,000, a nice profit on your investment." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. Yesterday, $50,000 would have been life-changing. Now, knowing what lay beneath their kitchen floor, the offer seemed almost insulting. "We're not interested in selling," Sarah said firmly. William's smile faded. "I see. Well, perhaps you'll change your mind. This house has challenges, more than you might realize. My great-grandmother died trying to maintain it. It would be a shame if history repeated itself." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. After he left, Sarah deadbolted the door with shaking hands. "He knows," she said. "Somehow, he knows about the treasure." What followed was a tense week of discoveries and decisions. Sarah found a letter hidden in one of Eleanor's journals, written but never sent, addressed to the future owners of Hartley House. In it, Eleanor detailed her family's shameful secret and her own tortured relationship with the blood money hidden beneath the kitchen. "I was too weak to expose it," Eleanor had written, but too conscience-stricken to use it. "I leave this burden to you, hoping you will have the courage I lacked." Meanwhile, William Hartley's tactics escalated. They found their tires slashed one morning, dead rats appeared on their porch. Official-looking letters arrived questioning the legitimacy of their property transfer, though Michael's research confirmed they were baseless. "We need help," Sarah said after a week of harassment. "We can't handle this alone." That's when they met Marcus Washington, a local historian and activist who ran a small museum dedicated to the county's immigrant history. Sarah had reached out to him after finding his name in one of her internet searches about the Hartley mining operations. Marcus, a dignified black man in his 70s, listened to their story with growing fascination. When they showed him the ledgers and a sample of the gold, his eyes filled with tears. "My great-great-grandfather worked in those mines," he said quietly. "He survived, but many didn't. We always suspected there was more to the story than the official records showed." Together, they hatched a plan. The treasure would be liquidated through proper channels, with full documentation of its origins. The proceeds would go to establish a foundation supporting the descendants of the miners who had suffered under Jeremiah Hartley's exploitation, funding education, healthcare, and community development. William Hartley fought them every step of the way, hiring lawyers and trying to claim ancestral rights to the treasure. But Sarah and Michael had Eleanor's letter and the moral high ground. The story made national news. Couple donates $30, million treasure to right historical wrongs. What happens next will turn this story upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The legal battle with William Hartley III intensified in ways Sarah and Michael never anticipated. 2 weeks after they announced their plan to establish the Miners' Descendants Foundation, Michael was arrested on bogus charges of trespassing and theft. The local police, clearly influenced by Hartley's connections, claimed Michael had stolen property from the house before the sale was final, a complete fabrication. Sarah spent their last $2,000 on bail and a lawyer, but it was Marcus Washington who truly came to their rescue. He organized a community protest outside the courthouse, bringing together descendants of the miners whose stories had been buried for generations. Local news cameras captured the crowd holding photographs of their ancestors, men who had died in Hartley-owned mines or survived with bodies broken by the dangerous work. "This isn't just about money," Marcus told the crowd. his voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "This is about justice delayed but not denied. The Chen family could have kept this fortune secret. Instead, they chose truth over treasure." The charges against Michael were dropped within 48 hours, but William Hartley wasn't finished. He hired private investigators to dig into Sarah and Michael's past, looking for any leverage. When that failed to produce results, the harassment escalated. Sarah woke one night to the smell of smoke. Racing downstairs, she found a pile of oily rags smoldering on their front porch, a fire that would have engulfed the wooden structure if she'd discovered it even minutes later. The security camera they'd installed after the tire-slashing incident captured a figure in dark clothing, but the image was too grainy for identification. "We should leave," Michael said after the fire department left. "Take what we can from the treasure and disappear. This isn't worth our lives." But Sarah surprised him with her fierce refusal. "Eleanor Hartley spent 60 years in this house, paralyzed by guilt and fear. I won't let her grandson drive us away. We're finishing what she couldn't." The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Patricia Hartley Morrison, William's younger sister, appeared at their door. Unlike her brother's imposing presence, Patricia was small and nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. "I need to tell you something," she said, clutching a worn leather satchel. "About my brother, about our family." Over coffee at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd first examined the treasure, Patricia revealed a truth that recontextualized everything. William wasn't just fighting for family pride or greed. He was desperate. "He's been living off our great-grandmother's reputation for years," Patricia explained. "Taking loans against future inheritance, making promises based on family wealth that doesn't exist. When Eleanor died and left nothing but the house, he was ruined. But he knew about the treasure we both did. Eleanor told us when we were children, made us swear never to touch it. So why didn't he search for it himself?" Sarah asked. "He tried. He spent months in this house after Eleanor died, tearing up floorboards, checking walls, but he was looking in the wrong places. Eleanor told us it was hidden where the guilty parties first stood, but we never understood what that meant. The kitchen, that's where the mine owners would have gathered to count their profits, isn't it?" Patricia opened her satchel and pulled out a bundle of letters. "These are from Eleanor to my mother. She wanted to make things right, but was terrified of destroying the family name. In her final letter, she said she prayed the next owners would have the courage she lacked." "And you?" Michael asked. "What do you want?" Patricia's smile was sad but genuine. "I want my brother stopped before he does something that can't be undone. And I want my family's name associated with healing, not harm. I'll testify about his threats, provide evidence of his debts, whatever you need." The legal proceedings that followed were swift. With Patricia's testimony and evidence of William's harassment, a restraining order was issued. The treasure's authentication and transfer to the foundation proceeded under federal protection, given its historical significance and value. William made one last desperate attempt to claim the fortune through ancestral rights, but the court ruled decisively. The treasure had been legally abandoned, hidden on property that was legally sold. The Chens were the rightful owners and could dispose of it as they chose. The day the foundation was officially established, the farmhouse was transformed. Hundreds gathered on the grounds Sarah and Michael had so carefully restored. The hole in the kitchen floor had been properly excavated and turned into a memorial space, with glass panels allowing visitors to see where the treasure had been hidden for over a century. Marcus Washington served as the foundation's first director, working with historians to trace descendants of the miners mentioned in Jeremiah Hartley's ledgers. The first scholarships were awarded 6 months later to 10 students whose ancestors had labored and died in Hartley mines. Healthcare clinics were established in 3 rural communities where mining families had settled. A museum dedicated to immigrant labor history broke ground on the site of one of the old Hartley mines. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Lee Wei, an elderly man from San Francisco, arrived at the farmhouse. His great-grandfather, Chen Ming, had died in a Hartley mine at age 23, leaving a wife and infant son. Lee Wei had grown up hearing stories of his ancestor, but never knew the full truth until the foundation contacted him. "My family always wondered why he came to Pennsylvania," Lee Wei said, standing in the memorial space. "Now we know. And now his sacrifice means something." Sarah and Michael kept only what they needed from the treasure, enough to fully restore the farmhouse and establish a small organic farm on the property. They turned the house into a bed and breakfast, with rooms named after the miners whose stories they'd uncovered. Guests came not just for the comfortable accommodations, but for the history, the ghost tours led by Sarah, who'd become an expert storyteller, and the chance to stand where such a dramatic discovery had been made. Patricia Hartley Morrison became a regular visitor, helping to document family artifacts and working to reshape the Hartley legacy. She established her own project, researching and acknowledging other injustices tied to the family's wealth. "We can't change the past," she often said, "but we can change how it shapes the future." William Hartley III declared bankruptcy and left the state. Reports placed him in Florida, then Texas, always chasing the next scheme. His children, freed from their father's obsession with reclaiming family fortune, chose their own paths. His daughter reached out to Sarah and Michael, thanking them for breaking the cycle. On a quiet evening 2 years after their discovery, Sarah and Michael sat on their restored porch, watching the sun set over their thriving gardens. The bed and breakfast was booked solid for the next 3 months. The foundation had awarded over 50 scholarships and funded 4 community centers. Their own restaurant dreams had evolved into a farm-to-table operation that employed 15 local people and donated profits to the foundation. "Do you ever regret it?" Michael asked, taking his wife's hand. "Giving away $30 million? Sarah considered the question, thinking of their comfortable but modest life, the satisfaction of honest work, and the knowledge that they'd transformed a shameful secret into a force for good. "Never," she said firmly. "We found something worth more than gold down there." "What's that?" "The chance to make things right. Eleanor Hartley spent decades paralyzed by guilt. We could have done the same, or we could have become like William, consumed by greed. Instead, we got to choose a different path." A car pulled up the driveway, Marcus Washington arriving for their weekly dinner, where they still planned foundation initiatives and shared stories of the families they'd helped. Behind him came Patricia, carrying a cake she'd baked using Eleanor's recipe, found in a cookbook tucked in the attic. As their friends joined them on the porch, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. They'd bought a farmhouse in desperation, thinking they were at the end of their story. Instead, they'd found themselves at the beginning of something far more valuable than money, a legacy of redemption and the proof that even the darkest secrets could be transformed into light. The Hartley Foundation, as it came to be known, expanded beyond anyone's initial vision. Universities established research programs into labor history using the digitized ledgers. Documentary filmmakers created a series about the Chinese miners whose stories had been erased. The Foundation's work inspired similar initiatives in other communities, uncovering and addressing historical injustices. But the most profound impact was personal. Families divided by generations of silence began to talk. Descendants of miners and mine owners sat together on the Foundation's board, working toward common goals. The farmhouse became a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing people who needed to see proof that transformation was possible. Eleanor Hartley's portrait, found in the attic and carefully restored, hung in the entrance hall. Sarah had insisted on including a placard with Eleanor's own words. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. May those who come after me find the strength I could not." 5 years after the discovery, a Hollywood producer approached Sarah and Michael about making their story into a film. They agreed, with conditions. The focus must remain on the miners' stories, profits would go to the foundation, and the movie would be filmed on location, bringing economic benefits to their community. The film's premiere was held not in Los Angeles, but in the old barn behind the farmhouse, converted into a community center. Descendants of the miners walked the red carpet alongside the stars who portrayed their ancestors. Li Wei, now a Foundation board member, gave a speech that brought the audience to tears. "This is not just a story about finding treasure," he said. "It's about finding truth, choosing justice over comfort, and discovering that the real gold lies in human connection and compassion." William Hartley III made one final appearance in their lives, arriving at the farmhouse on a rainy November morning 7 years after the discovery. He was older, grayer, and humbled by years of failure. Sarah found him standing in the memorial space, staring at the glass panels that revealed where his family's fortune had been hidden. "I came to apologize," he said simply, "and to thank you." "Thank us?" Michael couldn't hide his surprise. "You saved me from myself," William admitted. "If I'd gotten that money, it would have destroyed me completely. I've been in recovery for 2 years now, gambling addiction. I've started over, working as an addiction counselor. It's honest work, helping others escape the trap I fell into." He placed an envelope on the table. "My first year's salary. I want to donate it to the foundation in my great-grandmother Eleanor's name." She tried to warn me, but I was too blinded by greed to listen. Sarah and Michael accepted his donation and, more importantly, his apology. They even invited him to stay for lunch, sharing a simple meal at the same kitchen table where his ancestors had once counted their blood money. The conversation was awkward at first, but gradually evolved into something resembling understanding, if not quite friendship. "Eleanor would be glad," Patricia said later, having driven up to see her brother. She always believed in redemption. The farmhouse itself seemed to exhale years of held tension after William's visit. Sarah noticed at first the way sunlight seemed brighter through the windows, how the old floorboards creaked less ominously, as if the house itself had been waiting for this reconciliation. Their bed and breakfast evolved into a teaching center, hosting workshops on ethical business practices, restorative justice, and community healing. The kitchen, built over the site of the hidden treasure, became a gathering place where difficult conversations led to unexpected connections. Marcus Washington, now in his 80s but still sharp, established an annual gathering called Truth and Transformation. Descendants from both sides of the historical divide came together to share stories, acknowledge harm, and work toward healing. The event grew from 50 participants to over 500, requiring tents spread across the farmhouse grounds. One particularly moving moment came when the great-great-granddaughter of a mine owner stood beside the great-great-grandson of a miner who had died in a cave-in. They unveiled a memorial plaque together, their children playing at their feet, a new generation unburdened by the sins and sorrows of the past. Sarah and Michael's own children, initially skeptical of their parents' decision to give away a fortune, became some of the foundation's most passionate advocates. Their daughter, Emily, left her corporate law job to become the foundation's legal counsel. Their son, David, used his tech skills to create a database connecting descendants and preserving their stories. "You taught us that wealth isn't what you keep," Emily told them at a family dinner. "It's what you share." The ripple effects continued to spread. Other communities with hidden histories of exploitation began their own truth and reconciliation processes. The Hartley model, as academics called it, became a blueprint for addressing historical injustices through community action rather than government mandate. Corporate leaders studied the case, recognizing that acknowledging past wrongs could lead to stronger, more ethical business practices. Several companies established their own foundations to address historical labor abuses, inspired by Sarah and Michael's example. But perhaps the most significant change was in the town itself. The economic benefits of the foundation, the bed and breakfast, and the influx of visitors transformed the struggling rural community. Young families moved in, drawn by the strong sense of purpose and community. The main street, once dotted with empty storefronts, bloomed with small businesses. The local school, which had been slated for closure due to low enrollment, became a model for integrated historical education. Students learned about the miners alongside the mine owners, understanding how economic systems shape lives and how individual choices could perpetuate or challenge injustice. Sarah established a cooking school in the farmhouse kitchen, teaching traditional recipes from the various cultures represented by the miners. Her cookbook, From Hidden Treasure to Shared Table, became a bestseller, with proceeds supporting the foundation's work. Michael, his construction skills revitalized, led volunteer teams in restoring other historical buildings in the county. Each project uncovered new stories, new connections to the past that enriched the present. He became known as the Keeper of Memories, his careful restoration work preserving not just buildings, but the stories they held. On their 10th anniversary in the farmhouse, the community threw them a surprise celebration, the yard filled with hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their decision. Scholarship recipients who'd become doctors and teachers, families reunited through genealogy projects, neighbors who'd found purpose in the foundation's work, all gathered to express gratitude. Lee Wei, now bearing his ancestors' name with pride rather than sorrow, presented them with a gift from the Descendants Association, a beautiful quilt incorporating fabrics from each family's heritage, sewn together to create a stunning tapestry of interconnected stories. "You showed us that we are not separate threads, but part of the same cloth," he said. "Miner and owner, past and present, all woven together by choices we make today." That night, as the celebration wound down, Sarah and Michael walked through their house, now truly their home in every sense. The rooms that had once hidden shame now hosted joy. The kitchen floor that had concealed blood money now supported community feasts. The journals that documented exploitation now served as teaching tools for justice. "I've been thinking," Sarah said as they settled onto their porch swing, the same one they'd restored that first difficult summer, about Eleanor's letter. She said she hoped we'd have the courage she lacked. "I think she had more courage than she knew," Michael replied. "It takes courage to preserve evidence, to refuse to benefit from blood money, to leave clues for someone else to find. She planted seeds, we just happened to be the ones to harvest them." The moon rose over the farmhouse, silvering the gardens where vegetables grew for the community kitchen, the barn where workshops taught traditional crafts, the memorial space where truth had literally been unearthed. Somewhere in the walls, mice still scurried, but now their small sounds seemed part of the house's living symphony rather than signs of decay. William Hartley III had become a regular visitor, bringing clients from his addiction recovery practice to share his story of how losing everything had saved his life. He and Patricia worked together on a book about their family's history, unflinching in its honesty about the harm caused and the possibility of redemption. The book's dedication read, "To Eleanor Hartley, who preserved the evidence of sins while living a life of quiet atonement, and to Sarah and Michael Chen, who showed us that courage is contagious and that the heaviest burdens become lighter when shared." As their story gained international attention, requests poured in from communities around the world facing similar reckonings with historical injustice. Sarah and Michael traveled occasionally to share their experience, but always returned to the farmhouse, their anchor and reminder that transformation happens one choice at a time, one person at a time. The treasure had been worth $30 million in gold, but its true value, they'd learned, was immeasurable, counted not in coins, but in connections. Not in wealth, but in wisdom passed between generations. Not in what was hidden, but in what was revealed when people chose truth over comfort, community over greed, and healing over harm. "Do you think Eleanor knew?" Sarah asked one evening, reading through the old woman's journals for the 100th time. "When she refused to sell, refused to use the money, refused to destroy the evidence, do you think she knew someone like us would come along?" Michael considered the question. "I think she hoped. That's all any of us can do, make choices that create possibilities for good, even if we don't live to see the outcome." They rocked gently on the swing as fireflies began their evening dance across the gardens. Inside, guests from 3 different countries prepared dinner together in the kitchen, their laughter floating through windows that no longer needed boarding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose justice over easy answers. But tonight, Sarah and Michael Chen sat on their porch, 2 people who'd bought a farmhouse in desperation and discovered that the real treasure wasn't what was hidden beneath the floor, but what could be built upon a foundation of truth, courage, and the radical belief that even the darkest secrets could be transformed into light. The story could have ended there, with redemption and reconciliation neatly tied together. But life, as Sarah often reminded visitors, was messier and more miraculous than fiction. 15 years after the discovery, a young woman named Elena Petrov arrived at the farmhouse. She carried a battered suitcase and a story that would crack open yet another chapter of the Hartley legacy. "My great-grandmother worked in the Hartley house," she explained to Sarah over tea. "Not in the mines, in the house itself. She left behind journals, too, written in Russian. I've spent years translating them." The journals revealed that Jeremiah Hartley's wife, Margaret, had run her own form of exploitation, bringing in young immigrant women as domestic help, but essentially keeping them as indentured servants. Elena's great-grandmother, Anya, had been one of them. "But there's more," Elena said, pulling out a faded photograph. "Anya didn't just work here. She had a child. Jeremiah's child." The photograph showed a young woman holding an infant, standing in front of the farmhouse. On the back, in careful Cyrillic script, "My son, James." May he know the truth someday. This revelation sent shockwaves through the Hartley descendants and the Foundation. It meant there was an entire branch of the family, working-class descendants of an unacknowledged son who had never benefited from the Hartley wealth, but had suffered from its creation. Patricia and William, now reconciled siblings, embraced this news with remarkable grace. More family to make amends to, Patricia said simply. More truth to acknowledge. The Foundation expanded its mission to trace these hidden descendants, finding families across the country who carried Hartley blood, but not the Hartley name or privilege. Many had stories of struggle, of immigrant roots never acknowledged, of connections to power that had been denied and erased. Elena became the Foundation's Director of Hidden Histories, working to uncover not just the stories of miners, but of domestic workers, field hands, and others whose labor had built fortunes they never shared. Her work inspired a new generation of researchers to examine their own family histories with unflinching honesty. Every prominent family has these shadows, she said at a conference hosted at the Farmhouse. The question is whether we illuminate them or let them fester in darkness. The farmhouse itself seemed to embrace each new revelation. Sarah had long stopped being surprised when visitors found artifacts in odd places, a child's toy in the attic that led to discovering a nanny's story, a recipe card that revealed a cook's contribution to the family's social standing. The house gave up its secrets gradually, like a patient teacher waiting for students to be ready for each lesson. Michael, now in his 70s but still spry, had developed a theory. Houses absorb the energy of those who live in them, he told a group of architecture students. This one held pain for so long, it's eager to release it. Every truth told here makes room for more joy. As if to prove his point, the gardens around the farmhouse bloomed with unprecedented vigor. The memorial space had been expanded into a meditation garden where descendants from all branches of the extended history could find peace. The kitchen had been professionally renovated but retained its role as the heart of the property, no longer hiding treasure but creating it daily in the form of shared meals and difficult conversations. One autumn day, 20 years after the initial discovery, Sarah received a call that brought the story full circle in an unexpected way. A developer had purchased the site of the largest Hartley mine, intending to build luxury condos. But the excavation had uncovered something that required the Foundation's attention. Sarah, Michael, Marcus, now using a wheelchair but still sharp, and Elena drove out to the site. The developer, clearly frustrated, led them to a sealed chamber discovered 30 feet underground. Inside were bones. The remains of 17 miners, trapped in a cave-in that Jeremiah Hartley's records had listed as minor incident, no casualties. But here was proof of the lie: 17 men whose families had been told they'd abandoned their jobs, whose deaths had been covered up to avoid compensation and investigation. The developer, initially angry about the delay to his project, found himself moved by the solemnity of the moment. Marcus, tears streaming down his weathered face, began to sing a spiritual his grandmother had taught him, a song the miners might have known. "What do we do?" the developer asked, his profit margins suddenly seeming insignificant. Sarah looked at the bones that had waited over a century for acknowledgement. "We do what we always do. We tell the truth. We name them. We find their families. We make it right." The developer, a young man named James Chen, no relation, made a decision that shocked his investors. He donated the land to the Foundation, proposing instead a memorial park and museum on the site. "My grandfather came from China. In the 1960 seconds, he explained. He could have been one of these men, just born in a different time. The identification and repatriation of the remains became a community project. Forensic anthropologists worked alongside genealogists. Artists created memorial portraits based on archaeological evidence. The list of 17 names, once recovered from deeper research into immigration records, was read aloud at a ceremony attended by over 1,000 people. One of those names, Chen Ming, was Li Wei's great-grandfather, the one he'd thought died in a different mine. The discovery that his ancestor lay among the anonymous dead for over a century broke something open in Li Wei. At 91, he stood at the reburial ceremony and spoke of how lies compound across generations, how his family had spent decades wondering if their ancestor had abandoned them. "He didn't leave us," Li Wei said, his voice carrying across the crowd. He was stolen from us. But now he comes home. The 17 miners were buried in a new cemetery on a hill overlooking the town, each grave marked with a stone bearing their name and the words, "Unknown but not forgotten, silenced but not erased." The memorial park became a place of pilgrimage and education. Schools brought students to learn about labor history and the human cost of industrial progress. The museum, built with sustainable materials and powered by solar energy, housed not just artifacts, but interactive experiences that help visitors understand the miners' lives and deaths. But perhaps the most powerful addition was the Descendants Wall, a continuously growing installation where people could add names, photos, and stories of their ancestors who had labored in dangerous conditions. The wall soon extended beyond the museum, becoming a community art project that wound through the town. James Chin, the developer turned philanthropist, became one of the foundation's most passionate supporters. He redirected his company toward sustainable development, creating affordable housing for working families on sites that honored rather than erased labor history. "Sarah and Michael taught me that land holds memory," he said at a groundbreaking ceremony. "We can build on it, but we must build with respect for what came before." The 20-year anniversary celebration of the treasure's discovery filled the farmhouse grounds and spilled into the streets of the town. Thousands gathered, descendants of miners and owners, scholars and activists, neighbors and strangers, drawn by the story of transformation. Sarah and Michael, now white-haired but still vibrant, stood on the porch where they'd made so many decisions that shaped not just their lives, but the life of a community. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, along with the extended family of choice they'd created through years of truth-telling and bridge building. Patricia Hartley Morrison, now in her 80s, had become something of a folk hero, the heir who chose truth over treasure. She'd established her own foundation focused on helping wealthy families reckon with the sources of their fortunes. "Inherited wealth often comes with inherited guilt," she'd say. "The only cure is acknowledgement and action." William, 10 years sober and having helped hundreds through recovery, had written a memoir titled "Losing Everything, Finding Myself." He donated all proceeds to addiction treatment programs, saying, "Sarah and Michael saved my life by refusing to let me steal theirs." Marcus Washington had passed 5 years earlier, but his legacy lived on in the Marcus Washington Institute for Restorative History at the local college. His final words, reported by his daughter, were, "Tell them to keep digging. There's always more truth to find." The farmhouse itself had been designated a National Historic Site, not for its architecture, but for its role in what historians called the Great Unveiling, the moment when a nation began to truly reckon with how its prosperity was built. But for Sarah and Michael, the titles and recognition mattered less than the quiet moments. They still woke early, Sarah baking bread for the breakfast guests, though she had plenty of help now, Michael tending the gardens that fed the community kitchen. They still sat on their porch swing each evening, watching the fireflies and welcoming whoever needed a listening ear or a moment of peace. One evening, a young couple arrived, clutching a printout from a real estate website. They were looking at a house in the next county, they explained, an old place that had been in one family for generations but was now being sold cheap. "We've heard stories," the young woman said hesitantly, "about things that might be hidden there, dark things from the past. We don't know if we should buy it, if we should look for what might be there." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances, a whole conversation in a look after decades of marriage. "Buy it," Sarah said firmly. "Look for what's hidden, but be prepared what you find might change everything." "It did for us," Michael added. "We thought we were just buying a cheap house to escape bankruptcy. Instead, we found a purpose." "But what if what we find is terrible?" the young man asked. "What if it reveals things that hurt people? Then you'll have a choice," Sarah said, pouring tea with hands that had scrubbed floors and held gold and wiped tears of descendants discovering their histories. "You can hide it again, you can profit from it, or you can transform it into something healing. The choice is always there." After the couple left, promising to return with updates, Sarah and Michael sat in comfortable silence. The farmhouse creaked gently around them, no longer sounds of decay, but of settling, of being at peace with its history and purpose. "Do you think we've done enough?" Michael asked, a question that surfaced periodically over the years. "I think we've done what we could with what we found," Sarah replied. "Others will do more. Elena with her hidden histories, James with his conscious development, all those descendants creating new stories from old pain." A call came from their daughter Emily. Would they mind watching the grandkids next weekend? Life continuing its ordinary rhythms, even in a place that had become extraordinary. They agreed eagerly. The grandchildren loved exploring the farmhouse, always finding some small treasure, a button, a marble, a pressed flower in a book. As night deepened, they prepared for bed in the same room where they'd slept on an air mattress that first uncertain night. The room was comfortable now, filled with photos of the life they'd built the foundation board, scholarship recipients at graduations, miners' descendants, and owners' descendants breaking bread together. $30 million? Michael mused as they lay in bed. Sometimes I calculate what that would be worth now, invested properly. And? Sarah asked, though she knew where this conversation led. And then I think about what we invested it in instead. Not stocks or bonds, but people. Not portfolios, but possibilities. He reached for her hand in the darkness. No regrets. No regrets, she agreed. Outside their window, the memorial garden glowed softly in the moonlight. The names on the stones were visible even in darkness, the 17 miners, no longer anonymous, the workers whose stories had been recovered, all the hidden histories now brought to light. The Hartley house had kept its secrets for over a century. But secrets, Sarah had learned, were like seeds. Buried in darkness, they sprouted pain and poison across generations. Brought into the light, carefully tended, they could grow into something entirely different: understanding, justice, and ultimately, peace. Somewhere in the walls, the mice still scurried. Somewhere in the world, other houses held other secrets. But here, in this place, truth had made its home. And that, more than any treasure, was the real gold they'd found beneath the floor, the alchemy of transforming hidden shame into public healing, the magic of turning blood money into bonds of community, the miracle of discovering that the greatest wealth was what you gave away. As sleep finally took them, Sarah's last thought was of Eleanor Hartley, the woman whose conscience had preserved evidence and whose prayer for courage had been answered in ways she never could have imagined. Across the years and beyond death, Eleanor's hope had found its fulfillment in two desperate people who bought a farmhouse for $6,000 and discovered that some treasures are too valuable to keep. The story of the Hartley farmhouse had become legend, but Sarah and Michael Chin remained remarkably grounded, viewing themselves as accidental catalysts rather than heroes. Their greatest satisfaction came not from the accolades, but from the quiet moments when someone approached them with their own family secret, ready to begin the difficult work of truth-telling. As they aged, they prepared carefully for the farmhouse's future, establishing a trust that would maintain it as a center for restorative justice education. Their children would be involved, but so would representatives from all the communities touched by the Hartley legacy, ensuring that no single family or viewpoint would control the narrative. "We were temporary guardians," Sarah explained to a group of graduate students studying their model. "The house will outlive us, and it will keep teaching as long as people are willing to learn." The students, idealistic and eager, peppered them with questions about replicating their success elsewhere. Michael's answer was always the same. Start where you are. Every community has hidden histories. Every family has truths that need telling. You don't need to find 30 million in gold. You just need to find the courage to look. One student, a young woman named Amara, whose grandfather had worked in steel mills, raised her hand. But what if the people who benefited from injustice are still powerful? What if they fight back like William Hartley did? Sarah's smile was gentle but steely. They will fight back. Power rarely surrenders without struggle. But truth has its own power. We had no money, no influence, no connections. What we had was evidence and a community that was ready to hear it. That's often enough. The farmhouse had evolved into a living classroom. Architecture students studied how Michael had restored it using traditional techniques and sustainable materials. Sociology classes examined the ripple effects of the foundation's work. Business schools sent students to learn about ethical wealth distribution and stakeholder capitalism. But the most powerful learning happened in the kitchen, where Sarah still held court. The renovation had modernized appliances and improved efficiency, but the heart remained the same. The floor where the treasure was found had been preserved under reinforced glass, a reminder of what lay beneath. Cooking brings people together, Sarah explained to a group learning about reconciliation practices. It's hard to maintain hatred when you're sharing food you've prepared together. We've had descendants of miners and mine owners make pierogi side by side, sharing their grandmother's recipes and their family stories. The cookbook that emerged from these sessions, Recipes for Reconciliation, became required reading in several peace studies programs. Each recipe came with a story not just of the dish, but of the hands that had made it, the tables where it had been served, the conversations it had facilitated. Elena Petrov's work in uncovering hidden descendants had expanded into a national movement. DNA testing combined with genealogical research revealed thousands of unacknowledged family connections tied to industrial fortunes. The Hidden Branches project she founded helped people navigate the emotional complexity of discovering they were related to both the exploiters and the exploited. Americans love to claim their ancestors were kings or nobles, Elena said at a conference. But the real royalty in this country were the workers whose labor built everything we see. Their descendants deserve recognition and reparation. The reparation model pioneered by the Hartley Foundation had been studied and adapted worldwide. Unlike government-mandated programs that often stalled in political gridlock, this was voluntary, community-driven, and focused on building future opportunity rather than just compensating for past harm. James Chin, the developer who'd found the 17 miners, had become a leader in what was called conscious capitalism. His company now specialized in developing properties with dark histories, transforming them into spaces for healing and community building. Former plantation houses became reconciliation centers. Old factory sites were reimagined as mixed-income communities with built-in historical education. Every building tells a story, he said at a TED Talk that went viral. We can either silence those stories or amplify them. Sarah and Michael Chin taught me that amplification, though painful, leads to healing. The 20th anniversary of the discovery brought unexpected news. An elderly woman in California contacted the foundation, claiming to have letters from Eleanor Hartley that no one had seen. She was the daughter of Eleanor's best friend, and her mother had kept the correspondence secret, respecting Eleanor's wishes. Sarah and Michael flew out to meet her, their first long trip in years. The letters revealed even more layers to Eleanor's story. She had tried multiple times to expose the family's secrets, writing to newspapers and government officials, but had been blocked by lawyers and threatened with institutionalization by her own children. I am a prisoner in this house, one letter read, surrounded by the ghosts of those my father destroyed. I keep their names in my heart and their stories in hidden places, praying that someday someone braver than I will set them free. Another letter, written near the end of her life, seemed almost prophetic. I dream of a young couple, strangers to our family, who will buy this cursed house and transform it into something blessed. They will find what I've hidden and have the courage I lack. In my dreams, the house is full of laughter and the graves are marked with names. Sarah wept reading these words, recognizing Eleanor not as the weak woman her descendants had portrayed, but as someone who had fought a lonely battle against powerful forces, preserving evidence at great personal cost. They brought the letters back to the farmhouse, where they were added to the archive with ceremony. Patricia Hartley Morrison, reading her grandmother's words for the first time, finally understood the full weight of the legacy she'd inherited. She wasn't complicit, Patricia said wonderingly. She was a prisoner. All those years we thought she was hoarding the wealth out of greed. She was actually protecting evidence and hoping for justice. This revelation led to a re-examination of Eleanor's life and a posthumous recognition of her role in preserving the truth. A statue was commissioned, not a grand monument, but a simple figure of an elderly woman placing a document in a trunk with the inscription, Eleanor Hartley, 1878 to 1975, Guardian of Truth. The statue was placed in the memorial garden, where Eleanor's ghost, if it existed, could finally see the fruition of her desperate hope. As Sarah and Michael entered their 80s, they began to step back from day-to-day operations, though they still lived in the apartment above what was now a museum and education center. Their morning routine remained unchanged: coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise over the garden, greeting the early visitors who came to walk the memorial paths. Their children had taken up the mantle in their own ways. Emily had established a legal clinic, helping families navigate the complex process of historical reparation. David had created a technology platform connecting descendants and facilitating family history research. Even their grandchildren were involved, the youngest giving tours of the farmhouse with a child's directness that often moved visitors to tears. "My grandparents bought this house because they were poor," 10-year-old Maya would explain, "but they found out that being poor in money isn't the same as being poor in heart. They gave away millions of dollars because they said love multiplies when you divide it." The foundation's endowment had grown through additional donations from people inspired by the story. Other wealthy families, confronting their own problematic histories, contributed to the fund. A tech billionaire whose fortune was built on servers manufactured in sweatshops donated $100 million after visiting the farmhouse and experiencing what he called an awakening. But the most meaningful donations were often the smallest. A descendant of a miner sending $50 in honor of an ancestor. A teacher donating her birthday money to sponsor a student. A child's lemonade stand proceeds given because those miners were thirsty and no one gave them water. Each donation came with a story, and Sarah insisted on reading every one. "Money is just compressed stories," she'd tell Michael. "When people give, they're really sharing their hopes and hurts." The impact spread in ways they couldn't have imagined. Universities established entire programs around the Hartley model of restorative justice. The United Nations invited them to speak about grassroots reconciliation. Documentary films, academic papers, and even an opera were created about their story. But fame hadn't changed their fundamental approach. When visitors arrived at the farmhouse, they still might find Sarah in the kitchen, kneading bread and happy to chat. Michael could still be. Spotted in the garden, his movements slower now, but his eye for beauty undiminished. One day, a reporter asked them what they would change if they could go back to that moment when Sarah's foot went through the floor. "Nothing," Michael said immediately. "Really?" the reporter pressed. "You wouldn't keep even a little of the treasure?" Sarah and Michael exchanged one of their wordless conversations, decades of marriage compressed into a glance. "The treasure was never the gold," Sarah explained patiently. "The treasure was the choice. Every day we got to choose between hoarding and sharing, between silence and truth, between fear and love. That's the real treasure, getting to make that choice." "But surely," the reporter began. "Look around," Michael interrupted gently. "Look at this place. When we arrived, it was dying. The house, the community, the history itself was dying. Now it lives. Not because of money, but because of truth. You can't put a price on resurrection." As their story entered its third decade, new challenges emerged. Some descendants of the miners felt the foundation hadn't gone far enough in its reparations. Others argued it had gone too far, creating dependence rather than independence. The board meetings sometimes grew heated as different visions for the future competed. Sarah and Michael stayed out of these disputes, trusting the process they'd set in motion. "Democracy is messy," Sarah would say. "But it's better than one family deciding everything in darkness." The hardest moments came when hatred surfaced, white supremacists targeting the farmhouse for betraying their race, descendants bitter that they hadn't received more, people who saw the whole project as either too radical or not radical enough. During one particularly tense period, after vandals spray-painted slurs on the memorial stones, the community responded with a vigil. Thousands stood in the garden, candles illuminating the darkness, voices raised in songs that miners would have recognized: spirituals, folk songs, lullabies in a dozen languages. "Hatred is loud," Marcus Washington's daughter said that night, "but love is patient and persistent. This place has taught us that." As Sarah and Michael watched from their window, too frail now for late-night vigils, they held hands and remembered their own dark night of the soul, that moment in the empty kitchen when they'd almost given up, when the weight of the discovery had nearly crushed them. "We could have walked away," Michael murmured. "But we didn't," Sarah replied. And look what grew from that decision. The garden below them glowed with candlelight, each flame representing someone touched by their choice to transform a dark secret into illuminating truth. The 17 miners' names were spoken aloud, but so were hundreds of others, the hidden workers whose stories had been recovered, the descendants who'd found each other across divides of race and class, the living who'd been inspired to confront their own inherited shadows. On their 60th wedding anniversary, the community surprised them with a celebration that filled the farmhouse grounds. Representatives from every family touched by the foundation's work came to honor them. The gift was not gold or silver, but something more precious, a collection of letters from scholarship recipients, patients at the health clinics, children who'd learned their family histories, and even William Hartley III, now a grandfather himself, teaching his grandchildren about the dangers of greed and the power of redemption. Sarah and Michael sat on their porch, the same porch they'd first seen in such disrepair, now sturdy and welcoming. They were surrounded by the extended family of choice they'd created, people bound not by blood, but by the shared work of turning historical harm into contemporary healing. As the sun set over the memorial garden, casting long shadows from the statue of Eleanor Hartley, Sarah thought about legacy. They'd started with nothing but desperation and $6,000. They'd found a fortune and given it away. But what they'd built in its place, this community of truth-tellers and bridge builders, was worth more than any amount of gold. No regrets? Michael asked, as he did periodically, the question becoming a rhythm of their shared life. Only one, Sarah said, surprising him. What's that? I wish Eleanor could see this. I wish she knew that her prayers were answered, that her courage in preserving the truth wasn't wasted. As if in response, a breeze swept through the garden, setting the wind chimes, singing the same chimes they'd hung their first week in the house, now weathered but still musical. The sound seemed to carry a message across time, from a lonely old woman to the couple who'd fulfilled her desperate hope. Maybe she does know, Michael said softly. Maybe that's what ghosts really are, the dreams of the dead, waiting to be realized by the living. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, the farmhouse around them no longer hiding secrets but proclaiming truth, no longer hoarding treasure, but creating it daily in the lives transformed by the choice to share rather than steal, to heal rather than hide, to face the past with courage and build the future with hope. The last entry in Sarah's journal that night was simple. Today we were wealthy beyond measure, not in what we kept, but in what we gave away. The farmhouse stands as proof that even the darkest secrets can become the brightest lights, if we're brave enough to bring them out of hiding. Eleanor, you are not forgotten. Your courage echoes forward. Rest in peace. And in the memorial garden, under stars that had witnessed both the burying and the unearthing of truth, 17 miners' names glowed softly in the moonlight, no longer anonymous, no longer silenced, but part of a story still being written by everyone who chose truth over treasure, healing over hoarding, and love over fear. The Chen family story had become larger than they ever imagined, but at its heart remained a simple truth. Two people in desperate circumstances had made a choice that transformed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. The farmhouse they'd bought for $6,000 had become priceless, not for what was hidden beneath its floors, but for what had grown from the decision to share that discovery with the world. And somewhere in the gentle creaking of old timbers, in the whisper of wind through the memorial garden, in the laughter of children learning their true histories, Eleanor Hartley's ghost finally found peace. Her desperate preservation of evidence, her decades of guilty silence, her prayers for someone braver, all had led to this moment when truth was no longer buried, but bloomed in every corner of the property she'd guarded so long. The treasure had been found, but the real gold was what happened next, the alchemy of transforming historical harm into contemporary healing, the miracle of turning blood money into bonds of community, the grace of discovering that the greatest wealth was what you gave away. And in that giving, Sarah and Michael Chen had found something worth more than $30 million. They'd found the purpose that makes a life worth living, the community that makes a house a home, and the truth that sets everyone free. What an incredible journey of discovery, truth, and transformation. From a desperate couple buying a crumbling farmhouse with their last $6,000 to unearthing not just $30 million in gold, but a dark family secret that would reshape an entire community's understanding of its history. Sarah and Michael Chen's choice to give away the fortune and establish a foundation for the descendants of exploited miners shows us that true wealth isn't measured in what we keep, but in what we share. Their story reminds us that sometimes our greatest treasures are found not in gold, but in the courage to confront the past and build a better future. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more incredible true stories and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another amazing tale of unexpected discovery.